In the name of the one and only, we are beginning the next session of the Indigo Firmament, and we are continuing our discussion on the concepts of Islamist governance at the intersection of democracy and militarism. In the previous discussion, we elaborated on what militarism is and how it has evolved and what it has become. We also talked about how militarism is the direct opposite of democracy, in the context that, yes, democracy is a concept, it's an ideal, it's a form of governance, but militarism might be a tactic. But we explained that the two happens to be the polar opposites, in the sense that it's militarism that denies or creates distance between the political will of the people and its manifestation, and how it intervenes to create distance between people and their government. Today we are going to go a step further in this context, and I will, as I said in the previous discussion, that the subject matter is a bit too academic, so I'm going to try to kind of dilute it so that we can understand it a little bit better. I'm addressing this topic from a different angle, and that is projecting fear across the cultural divide. And again, we are focusing still on democracy and militarism, but now we are introducing the concept of a cultural divide into this. That on the road to democracy, the political experience of every culture leaves its trail of failures and successes as it tries to overcome the many hurdles and hindrances on the evolving blueprint of government and governance. Therefore, while democracy is a human ideal, not the cultural monopoly of any, but the cultural experience of every society leaves its mark on democracy in respect to how it is understood, how it's implemented, and how much success they have had in its implementation, both from the sense of from the point of view of the governed as well as of the governing entities. Now, the major impediment to the development of democracy in the West, now I'm trying to create a contrast between how democracy is seen from the West and from the East. Basically, we are talking about Christian West, Europe, or North America, or the Muslim East or the Middle East. So that the major impediment, the major impediment to the development of democracy in the West was the medieval tyranny of theocracy. It was the theocracy of the Dark Ages that prevented the development of democracy in the West. There was the Greek democracy, either ideal or idealized, and the experimentation with that concept of democracy theoretically and practically. And then comes the Romans, and then comes the Dark Ages, and in a way that distance is created between what the Greek democracy would have been, was and would have been, and what it has become, or that the Western democracy as it's linked to its Greek past. How much of this is really in the practical sense related to that democracy. So the villain here is or was the medieval tyranny of theocracy in the West. Now, the Muslim experience is different. That in the Muslim East, the culprit was political dysfunction of Oriental despotism. Otherwise, the state and the loosely structured religious power centers pursued separate paths, except for the authoritarian rulers. Occasional calls on ulama or Islamic scholars was for the endorsement of democracy. Now, in plain English, in the Muslim East, it was the ulama, the scholars, those who could have become the backbones of a theocracy. They stood in the way. They prevented the merger between church and state, so to say. And in that case, the villain for the West, which was religion, was not necessarily the villain for the East. And it is the projection of this fear that, because the Western experience, Western European and American experience, is that it's religious theocracy or religious thought or religion in general that stands in the way of democracy. This is a Western fear. And they are projecting that on the Eastern societies, and any government or any political movement that has any inclination, identification, or relationship with a religious thought is viewed as a boogeyman, to put it plainly, by the West. The Muslim culture rose to become an Islamic civilization because of religion. Christian Europe went into its dark ages because of religion. In other words, the experience of the two cultures are the direct opposite when put side by side. In other words, to look at the flip side of the coin, that Western civilization rose to prominence as it is now. Western civilization rose to prominence because it stayed away from religion. It separated church from state. Muslim civilization rose to power when it endorsed religion, not as a theocracy, but to use it as a source of inspiration and to use its universality and to accept its attitude towards the inclusion of minorities and the inclusion of others. So the Islamic civilization became a civilization not on the backs of Arab scholars, philosophers, and thinkers, but on the backs of Arabs and Persians and Indians and Turks and Zoroastrians and Hindus and Buddhists and many other diverse cultures and religious communities. So it was the endorsement of diverse thought and cultural and religious diversity that give rise to what eventually became the Islamic civilization. And religion and religious thought were not excluded from that. So therefore, the cultural experience of the two are the direct opposite. The Muslim East and the Christian West may live side by side, but their experience in government and governance are totally different. So what happens now in the 21st century is that when Muslims are thinking of democracy versus the same in the case of the West, the reaction is completely different. We could look at this in the sense that it's the dark side of our past. And I'm talking about both cultures. It's the dark side of our past that casts shadow upon our present. When fears are projected upon the other across the cultural divide. The fear of creating a theocracy is a concern of the West and the westernized in the East. That's projected upon Middle Eastern political reality that resists being defined from without. So, the fear of theocracy, that was a problem for the West, and the West automatically thinks that, yes, if it had been a problem for the West, it must also be a problem for everybody else. That is the projection of their political experience, historically speaking. That is not only projected upon the other, but that the other is defined in that. And what is worse is that because the Muslim society is in a doldrum, and most of its systems, that includes economic, political, as well as educational, are basically Western systems. So Muslim scholars raised in a Western educational system get as a part of this package, this Western thought that religion and state must be separated, and separated on the basis of how it is understood in the West. In other words, the Westernly, if I can use that, coin that term, the Westernly educated Easterners, the Westernized Easterners are thinking Western when they too show the same fear, the fear of the separation of state and church from a Western perspective. And they forget to go back to their own history, that the separation of state and church was never a problem in the Muslim land. I mean, we can't say never, categorically never, but for the most part it was not a problem for the Eastern states. Because for the most part, again, they did not develop theocracies, except for the few instances that we have discussed in the past, and we might go back to them when and if necessary. Now, the Muslim society does not fear theocracy. They despise authoritarianism that brings injustice. They are calling for justice. Okay, that's why Islamism, contrary to what its name suggests, does not advocate religious reform, but connotes agenda of political liberation. See, it was religious corruption of the Christian theocracies of the Dark Ages that made it an absolute necessity for the Protestant Reformation, or for Reformation in general within the Christian world. So because Christianity has, or rather Christian theocracy, to put it more accurately, had become so corrupt that the state and the church had become one, and they had become corrupt together, that a reform was absolutely necessary, and that reform had to be at one and the same time a political reform and a religious reform, and they did follow one another from Lutheran to the Age of Enlightenment. Now, in the Muslim world, however, anytime you suggest reform, they show a very, very strong reaction. And part of that reaction is justifiable, and part of it is not. The part that is not justifiable is that when such a reform is suggested, pattern after what happened to Christian Europe. Because Muslims who know their history, they know that that is not what they need. That they do not need a religious reform as such. The part that is justifiable is one that, yes, there are archaic, obsolete concepts that are presented as part of religious belief system that do require, if not a reform, certainly they require a revision and updating or reloading of the concept, to use a little more modernistic terminology. So they, instead of a reform, a religious reform, Muslim societies need to have a reform that connotes an agenda of political liberation. They are politically not liberated. They know that's where the problem is. And let me explain the political liberation. Muslim societies, the majority of them at one point, were colonized. They were subjugated. Then they were liberated around the European War I and II. But this liberation was in name only, as say after the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, the British and the French divided up Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and Palestine, for example. So changing the shackles of suppression from one authoritarian regime to another does not constitute liberation. So the people at present in most of the Muslim majority societies are under two heavy layers of political suppression. One, they are under the suppression of a local leader, a president, a king, or some such authority. And two, that authority, that president, or that king is under the pressure of a foreign superpower. And so therefore, the grassroots of the Muslim society are doubly suppressed. One, by the global superpower rivalry and competition, and two, by the local or regional one. And so for them, the only way out has to be political liberation that may or may not have the religious component in it. But the element of including a religious component into a reform is nothing but a projection of the West. And it's in that context that it is not called for. Although there are good enough reasons in and of themselves that recommend that the Muslim world goes through a religious reformation, but on their own terms, not under pressure from the West, because the two cultures had a different religious experience. So Islamic revivalism is not akin to European religious reformation. Rather, it is a creation to the religious, rather it's a reaction to the religious overtones of the 19th century European colonial suppression and the present Western imperial domination of the Muslim lands and the Muslim resources. And so therefore, revivalism, the few attempts that have been made, have also been hijacked. The Wahhabi revivalism is a good example of that. That which was supposed to liberate the society put them under more shackles, and perhaps even worse, because the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula were suffering under the tribal traditions that had dominated a more puritanical religious thought and religious understanding. And with Wahhabism, aside from the earlier years, it eventually sunk back into another depression in which the oppression was now justified in the name of religion, as it was justified in the name of local tradition in the past. I'm talking about the 17th and early 19th century. So when you look at it more in the context of a political reality, whether it's Kashmir or it's Palestine, or for that matter any other parts of the Muslim lands that are, from Chechnya to the other republics in the Caucasus, that there is still a Western domination, either directly or through proxy, which is what the Muslims are resisting. And the Muslim societies are then in a bind. If they express such resentment through the structures of the polity, the structure of the governments are already bought. They are in the pockets of imperial powers. So they have no choice but to operate outside of the political structure. Many of the parliaments and national assemblies of one type or another are not conducive to the expression of really critical thought that recommends a political liberation of the society. They all obviously work for the status quo, because the status quo is beneficial to the superpowers, and the superpowers want to keep things as they are, but not to change. And this results in a frustration. And when individuals and groups operate or resort to extreme actions in the form of political violence, then they are vilified politically, ideologically, and even religiously. And so they have no choice but then as they are being marginalized, then they become radicalized too. So they are in a way a product of the circumstance for which we in the West are responsible. Only because we are supporting dictators that close the venues for a political discourse, for a political dialogue. We are supporting dictators who are suppressing the freedom of thought and the freedom of speech. Perhaps more so the freedom of speech rather than the freedom of thought. I take that back. And so therefore, because the economic and perhaps more accurately the corporate interests of the West demand that we support dictators who are doing our biddings, the bidding of the corporations. Therefore, the alignment falls as follows. It's the West and their crony rulers in the Middle East on one side that are resisted by organizations, individuals, and political entity who in their frustration as they are being marginalized and radicalized have no choice but to become politically violent. Now, then in general terms, that it's this disdain for the role of religion in government that may explain the subtle euphoria in the West and the toppling of democratically elected governments by the militaries in many of the Muslim majority states. A clear example is the toppling of the Egyptian democratically elected Egyptian government of Morsi by the Egyptian military, and the Egyptian constitution that was trampled upon, which was used as a valid justification for creating more stability. And then what we did was to the fear that we had from that particular quote-unquote Islamist movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was concern number one for the West, which was whether they were willing to live in peace with Israel, whether the new Egyptian government would honor its peace treaty with Israel. And even when the Muslim Brotherhood clarified that and accepted that they would honor the treaty with Israel, it was still not enough for us. And so they first made sure that Egypt goes through a proper procedure for its election. That took some 2 weeks to have the parliamentary elections, to make sure that they were proper and that the international observers were there to see that there was no tampering or interference in it. And the result was an overwhelming majority for the Muslim Brotherhood. When subsequently there was time for the presidential election, and the election commission realized that the Muslim Brotherhood again had won the presidency, they delayed the results for a considerable period of some 10 days or so. And during that time, before they allow the Muslim Brotherhood to take over the presidency of Egypt, they first nullified the parliamentary election so that they will take the parliament back from them. Had they allowed Egypt under a Muslim Brotherhood parliament and a Muslim Brotherhood president to run the affairs, that if they had succeeded, which is perhaps what the West feared, it would have created a good model for development, where a state honored its international treaties, especially those with Israel, and managed the affairs of a country that is in dire economic needs that could not survive without Western assistance. On the other hand, if such a government with a majority in the parliament and having the presidency, if it had failed, people would have understood that yes, there was an opportunity for an experimentation with such a concepts that are rooted in some religious thought, and we found out that it does not work, then the Egyptians themselves would have opted for a quote-unquote a non-religious government to themselves. It would still have been democratic. The Egyptians would have been convinced that they had tried something that they thought would work, and the Muslim Brotherhood would have learned from its lesson and from its shortcomings. But Egypt would have remained a democratic state, because a tradition of democracy and election would have become the norm, not a military takeover. It would have, that government, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood or any opposition that would have won the subsequent election, would have both established a tradition. But that was not allowed. Instead, the government of Morsi, from the very start, faced a staunch opposition in a parliament that was not based on its most democratic election results, and therefore a stalemate, a stagnant situation developed in Egypt, which is not much different than what we have in Afghanistan. That in the 2014 election, we had a winner and a loser. And yes, every election has its disputes. And at worst, they should have allowed, if there were disputes, they should have allowed for a recount of the votes. But the worst mistake that the United States, in this case, Secretary of State John Kerry, did was to, number one, violate a certain principle that was the norm in American politics, namely that of having the winner and the runner-up becoming part of the American presidency until 1804, when a constitutional amendment was added to have the president and the vice president run on the same ticket. Prior to that, we in the United States did not have a ticket as a Democratic, Republican, or of any other party. So prior to 1804, whoever won the election was elected as president. Whoever won the second largest became the vice president. And the reason Americans got rid of that was that obviously the person who ran against the winner would have views that were completely the opposite. He was actually the leader of the opposition. And you can't put two people of opposing viewpoints in virtually the same office to run a government. It would make the government virtually dysfunctional. And in order to remedy that problem, the United States created in 1804, I think through a constitutional amendment, that candidates for the presidency of the United States will not run alone, but would run as a ticket, that both the president and the vice president must be, so to say, on the same page politically, so that there will be no discord in running the affairs of the state. Now, what John Kerry did in Afghanistan 2014 was it trampled on the Constitution of Afghanistan, in which the United States played a major role. And trampling it is that it amounts to creating a new post to reverse that process of the American government of 1804 in the case of Afghanistan, that the winner and the runner-up were both put in charge of the government. And these two people, who had, at least during that long political campaign period, if not earlier, were not looking eye to eye on almost every issue. They were diametrically opposed to almost every political issue and every solution for the Afghan crisis. But John Kerry created a post for the runner-up as the chief executive officer, a corporation, not a country. Created virtually a CEO position for the runner-up, and the end result was that Afghanistan was denied of a legitimate opposition in the parliament. If Abdullah would have accepted the results of the election, he would have been a legitimate opposition leader and a viable candidate for subsequent elections. He would have had his name, his following, his parliamentarians, and he could have come up with basically much better plans, some of his own, and many of those that may have been the result of any failure, potential failure by the Ghani's government in Afghanistan. But not only was Afghanistan denied this legitimate opposition party in the parliament, but it created a stalemate at the very top of the government, a polarized stalemate, which has resulted in a situation right now in a stagnant political crisis where nothing happens unless both heads, the president and the CEO of Afghanistan, sign on to any particular project, developmental, economic, social, or otherwise. And so when we are talking about the context of a reformation in governance, it's that many of the Muslim states, especially those in which the U.S. has intervened now, they have virtually become guinea pigs for political experimentation, but unfortunately not well thought out experimentations. So to go back to the argument of the projection of fear upon the other turns this cultural divide into an unfathomable abyss. The Muslim society rejects the universality of democracy, and in turn, Western democracy, they reject the universality of democracy, and in the term Western democracy, they only see Western as an indication of its beginning, of its being culturally exclusive, and therefore alien, and subsequently un-Islamic. So, Western democracy, what is in that name? Democracy is the yearning and the hope and the dream of any society. Any people anywhere would like to and would love to live under a democratic government. This is not a Western monopoly. It is not that only Western people think that way, or that only Westerners deserve that. All human beings deserve to live under a democratic type of government. So if that is the case, then democracy should not take any prefix or suffix or any attribute to be labeled as Eastern, as Western, or Muslim, or whatever. There is no such a thing as Muslim democracy or Islamic democracy. There is no such a thing as Western democracy. Democracy is democracy. It's a common human desire. But in this politically charged environment between the East and the West, when all relations are defined by a colonial mentality, they are defined by a culture of relativism or cultural relativism, that they are defined by American exceptionalism as far as the United States involvement is concerned. In this kind of charged environment, when you take, let's use a corporate terminology, when you take a product such as democracy and label it as Western democracy, you cannot expect the people of the Middle East to accept it, not because of what democracy is, but because of how it has been packaged. Because that Western implies a cultural exclusivity. And when you apply cultural exclusivity in the context of cultural relativism, which is based on some sort of a politically correct sounding neo-colonialism, then it becomes an alien concept. Then, obviously, if the opposing camp, that's the Muslim East, if they are defining themselves in any other way, they will make sure that the word democracy is not a word with which they would associate, because it has now a foreign connotation. So if the West claims it as its own, the mere fact that it claims democracy as its own, it becomes alien to the other. Because the West claim to democracy reinforces that very notion. The West projects its fear of theocracy and treats any movement, organization, or party whose name is prefixed with Islam or Islamic or Muslim. They treat it like a plague of theocracy. The Muslims' portrayal of their political organizations in religious terms doesn't help the situation either. So the more the West fears anything Muslim or Islamic, because it is the other, the more the Eastern cultures, in this case the Muslim cultures, they would name everything Islamic, legitimate or not. We go from the use or overuse, and perhaps more accurately, the abuse of the word Islamic in the names of many of the governments that are hardly legitimate, let alone being truly independent. That any colonel or general that takes over the reins of government in a military coup, the next day all he has to do is to claim that now this is an Islamic republic. It gives them protection, at least in the eyes of the least educated, the most religious layers at the bottom of the social strata in those countries. So therefore, the word Islamic becomes an instrument in their hands, that you can do any kind of corrupt, resort to any kind of corrupt action in running any administration. So long as you call it Islamic, then you expect people to see it that way. And for a time it works. But by the time people wake up, then those governments have become strong enough, especially with their foreign allies, to stay in power. And therefore, the most corrupt of these governments are the ones that are called Islamic. Let me repeat one more time. The most corrupt of these governments in the Muslim majority societies that are called themselves Islamic or un-Islamic. Not because of what they claim to be, but because of how they operate. And so the two opposing, diametrically opposing concepts that we discussed in our previous session were how democracy is the direct opposite of militarism in global politics. Now, in this next version, in respect to the Muslim world, then the two opposite terms become democracy and Islam or Islamic or Islamist. And so, either by design or by default or through oversight, the use, abuse, and misuse of these terms for any form of government has created an environment where the sensitivity to the terms are more important than the practicality of the concepts in, so to say, applied government, if you can coin another term. I think we've been a little generous on that. So back to the concept of, again, its application, that this fear accounts for the frequent Western interventions in Muslim societies to scuttle any prospects of success of the nascent Islamist movements and the reaction and response of Muslim masses radicalized in frustration. So, speaking of democracy, where is the voice of the people? The voice of the people is either suppressed by the layers of illegitimate authority, domestic, regional, or global, or their voices are hijacked. Now, we did talk about how democracy can't be Western, but that's how it's presented. We can also say that then Islamism or Islamist can't be the monopoly of the few. Islam as religion is a belief system of the masses. The interpretation of their concepts is the prerogative of each individual. But when we use Islamic as a political slogan, as an attribute to an ideological tendency, it's in that case where Islamic, Islamist, or for that matter, Islam in general, is hijacked from its norm and is utilized for political objectives, and unfortunately, in many cases, through political violence that victimizes many Muslims, but more recently, unfortunately, many non-Muslim minorities, such as those in Syria and in Iraq and in Yemen. And so therefore, this hijacking of the term Islamist is perhaps as bad as the hijacking of another term, the word jihad, which is simply a concept of resisting the temptation and negative propensities so you can realign yourself with a harmonic convergence in the totality of one humanness within the cosmic reality that is known sometimes as God or the divine. Jihad is, one more time, resisting the negative propensities that may have disaligned you from a harmonic convergence with the divine. That is jihad. But when used politically and ideologically, especially in the context where you define the right and the wrong, then jihad had become a pretty nasty term, the way it is used. And now Islam is following into the same pattern, and Islamist movements and their general use or abuse or utilization by groups that resort to political violence, and therefore out of that necessity it equates Islam or Islamist with terrorism, and the terms become synonymous. And so the result of Western interventions in the affairs of Muslim lands that create political upheavals and turmoils that then result in the formation of resistant groups that may or may not be endorsed by the establishment and are vilified at home or marginalized abroad. And with a broad brush, we name them as terrorists, but more so as Islamic terrorists. And so therefore, to look at least to the events of the post-Soviet era, in most of these interventions, whether it was Tajikistan 1991, Algeria 1992, Afghanistan 1992, and then 1995, Azerbaijan 1992, Turkey 1996, Iran 1997, Indonesia 1998, Gaza, Palestine 2006, Egypt 2012, and in many other states that have been affected by the Arab Spring, the common denominator is, in the final analysis, the vilification of religious terminologies and, by extension, the communities in the Muslim majority states. And as we do not run out of ideas, but we do run out of time, we will have to elaborate on most of these perhaps in our next program. And until then, we bid you farewell and have a nice day, night, morning, evening, or any other time that is defining your reality. Go with peace.